Sat Sri Akal, and welcome to the 19th ICTM Dialogue on Decolonization. I am Francesca Cassio, Professor of Music and Sardarni Urban Score Chair in Sikh Musicology at Hofstra University, Long Island. I'm speaking to you today from Glen Cove on Long Island, the ancestral homeland of the Matinecock Nation that was colonized at the end of the 17th century. And talking about coloniality, the title of our panel today is The Necessity of a Decolonial Frame, Undoing the Inscriptions of Colonial Modernity in the Study of Sikh Musical Traditions. The focus of our interdisciplinary session is the Sikh musical heritage, a long neglected area in the South Asian music scholarship. Sikh Kirtan is becoming increasingly popular, especially in the West, among the Sikh diaspora and among Westerners interested in Eastern philosophy and lifestyles. There is an encouraging new wave of studies in academia and initiatives on social media about Sikh Kirtan in the diaspora and in modern forms, although often through the lenses of Western universalism and reinterpretations of Hindu ideologies about sacred sound and devotional music. This colonially derived narrative not only has marginalized the study of the Gur-Sikh musical heritage, but has especially delegitimized its pre-modern history and its own epistemic ground. Therefore, I felt necessary to engage with scholars of Sikh studies whose works focused on post-colonial and decolonial approaches. Through the case study of the Sikh heritage, we all hope to cause a paradigm shift in the study, the teaching, and the practice of Gurbani Kirtan, as well as to establish a decolonial frame that allows voices and narratives alternative to the singular hegemonic history of South Asian music to be heard. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague at Hofstra University, Professor Balbinder Singh Bhogal, in conversation with Professor Nirinjan Kaur Khalsa Baker, streaming from Los Angeles, Loyola Marymount University, and another special guest. We are very honored to have Bhai Baldeep Singh, who will be speaking from New Delhi. I will introduce the speakers after my talk, and in my talk I will provide an outline of the Sikh musical traditions and also of the framework that in somehow marginalized the study of Gurbani Sangeet. So allow me a second to set my and share my screen. We will be in dialogue after each one of us will present. We will be in dialogue. We will ask ourselves some relevant questions about the practice, the history of marginalization also of the Gurbani Sangeet, and then we'll take also your questions. So you can use the chat to type your questions, and then I will read the questions for our attendees. Thank you very much. I will begin with an audio. I think it's very important to have a sonic idea of the topic that we will be discussing today.
Bilawal Mahalla Panjwan शब्द है सांत पाई गुर सदगुर पूरे सुख उपजे बाजे अनहद तूरे। इसकी बंदिश राग बिलावल चार तार त्रुप्त विच।
we have just heard is a recording of a composition attributed to the fifth Guru Arjan Dev, recorded back in 1975 by the renowned brothers Bhai Avtar Singh and Bhai Gurcharan Singh, sons of the legendary Kirtaniya Bhai Sahib Jwala Singh. This is a fine example of a hymn from the Sikh heritage, sung according to the raga and the form indicated in the Sikh scripture, and transmitted within the Sikh parampara since the times of the Sikh gurus. A recording like this one is just the tip of an iceberg. It is the product of an entire cultural ecosystem which surprisingly has never been documented and analyzed by ethnomusicologists. When back in the early 1990s I began my research, I was surprised that Sikh music literature, written and oral, was completely absent in the dominant narrative of South Asian music. This led me to investigate the very framework and the colonially derived epistemic ground that divided South Asian music into two major categories: the great and the little traditions. While some ethnomusicologists, like for instance Richard Wolff and Peter Manuel, have addressed the implications of mapping musics according to a hierarchical framework, the Sikh musical heritage is still overlooked through this schema as a peripheral tradition derivative from a great tradition. In order to highlight how this binary framework affected the scholarship on Sikh musical literature and practices, ultimately delegitimizing the place of Sikh heritage in history's pages, my talk will focus on three key points: ragas, kirtan, and the pluriversal nature of Sikh heritage. The singing of the sacred word, or Gurbani Kirtan, was established in the early 16th century by the first Sikh Guru, Nanak, who left his message in songs set to melodic frameworks called ragas. To Guru Nanak are attributed 974 hymns in 19 ragas and their 26 variants. These constitute the ground of a poetical and musical repertory that flourished during the time of the following 9 Sikh gurus. By the early 17th century, the number of the hymns had increased to more than 5,000. In 1604, the fifth guru, Arjan, collected in one volume, the Adi Granth, the verses of his predecessors along with his own hymns, and selected raga-based songs attributed to the saint poets of Bhakti and Sufi traditions. In the main corpus of the Adi Granth, the hymns called Shabads are arranged according to 30 main ragas and their variants. The same schema is preserved in the later version of the scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, recompiled in 31 ragas by the last Guru, Gobind Singh, who, before his death, attributed sovereign authority to the sacred word, Bani, as the sole living eternal Guru of the baptized Sikhs. Sikh scholars and practitioners unanimously agree that Gurbani Kirtan is Shabad Pradhan, meaning text-driven, to indicate the primary importance of the word regarded as the Guru over the musical rendition of the ragas. Over time, the raga setting became less relevant for the singing of the scriptural hymns and is now deemed as an elitist, Puratan, meaning old, form performed only by few experts. It goes often unrecognized, though, that the raga repertory of the scriptural hymns was shaped during the pre-colonial era, and therefore it should be understood in the context of pre-modern devotional literature and sonic practices. Gurbani Sangeet, a term that we use here to indicate the musical knowledges to sing and perform the Bani, presents common traits with other raga-based traditions like the Haveli Sangeet and the Samaj Gayan of the Vaishnava congregations in Uttar Pradesh and the Padavali Kirtan practice in Bengal. Like the Gurbani, these traditions are Padapradhan Kirtans that have devotional padas, poetical verses, set to ragas and big talas, meaning slow-paced rhythmic cycles, laid in a fourfold Drupad form, and these padas are collected in anthologies that use ragas as organizing principle. Among these traditions, the most documented is the Haveli Sangeet of the Vallabha Sampradaya, founded by Sri Vallabhacharya Mahaprabhu, who was a contemporary of Guru Nanak. The Haveli Sangeet has been thoroughly studied for its continued practice, but also because it represents the closest link between the Vaishnava devotional music and North Indian classical music, as Selina Thielemann and others maintain. The connection between the devotional music of the temple and the classical art form of the court has been framed in different ways. And there are disagreements among scholars whether it is the devotional form that has influenced the court music or vice versa. The majority of ethnomusicologists, however, tend to interpret the use of ragas in devotional music as adopted from the great tradition, from the classical art forms performed by specialized court musicians. In a recent essay, Aline Miner compared the ragas of the Guru Granth Sahib with those mentioned in two Vaishnava anthologies, maintaining that the Bhakti composers or compilers who originally specified ragas as organizing principles were likely linked to courtly music specialist circles. A raga is a template for melody, and the creator of the melody must be a specialist. Excuse me. In relation to Gurbani literature, the notion of a raga composer, performer as a specialist must be critically situated, as it seems to contrast with Sikh thought, expressed, for instance, in the following verse by the fifth Guru. Katha, Kirtan, Rag, Naad, Tuna, Yeho Baneo Suao. In Gurbani, raga is not only the organizing principle of the Sikh scripture, but is an integral part of Sikh education and experience, along with Katha, Kirtan, Naad, Tuna, necessary and complementary for imparting Gurmat, the Guru's teaching to all, regardless of status, gender, and literacy. I argue that relegating the raga to an aesthetic experience, a mere decoration of the sacred word, is an approach that came with colonial modernity, and it eventually sanctioned the divide between the literary and the sounded word. This approach is not only contributed to view the raga repertory in the Guru Granth Sahib and in the Gurbani Parampara as necessarily derivative from a classical core tradition, but it still has a strong impact on notions, practices, and productions of contemporary Sikh music. In their volume on Drupad, Ritvik Sanyal and Richard Widdes notably included the raga-based Gurbani Kirtan repertory and wrote that before partition, Muslim musicians were employed by Sikh religious leaders to compose music. They also taught Sikh and Hindu pupils. Music of ultimately Hindu origins was adapted by Muslims for use in Sikh rituals. While cross-pollination between the court and the temple happened during the colonial era of the Sikh history and has to be credited and studied, the notion of the raga repertory as a borrowed knowledge, an adaptation from the great tradition, in turns marginalized Gurbani Kirtan as a subaltern genre, a legal tradition delegitimizing its history and epistemic ground. Peter Manuel points out that the tendency to consider the hierarchy of vocal musical genres as a pyramid with abstractly musical classical genre at the apex and overwhelmingly text-driven Shabad Pradhan genres on the light or folk base is problematic. Introducing the notion of the intermediate sphere genres, Peter Manuel suggests that, once established, they tend to operate and evolve in their own social musical strata in a manner parallel to classical music tradition, rather than constantly engaging with it. The concept of the intermediate sphere opened a new understanding of the dynamics within and among traditions. On a similar note, Richard Wolff warned that the implications of mapping music cultures according to a vertical hierarchy led scholars to interpret the Lido as a local variant, a version of what is found in the great tradition, whereas many musical traditions of South Asia cannot be placed in these boxes. Although ethnomusicological research is now reoriented on the study of local knowledges and alternative indigenous narratives, to this day, not only is Kirtan still viewed as an abstract, monolithic genre of devotional songs, but also in this context, the Gurbani always appears as a variant of a practice of Hindu origins. And this takes us to the third point. The overarching Hindu ideologies about sacred sound and devotional music are often applied to Kaur, to Sikh Kirtan, without a critical study of the epistemic ground of Sikhi, supported by an actual documentation of the heritage repertories, like the example I played at the beginning of this talk. Post-colonial and decolonial Sikh scholars have voiced a solid critique of Orientalist frameworks, addressing the impact of what Arvind Manders defines the Vedic economy on the study of Sikh thought and practices. A certain historical complicity between Orientalism and Brahmanism, an economy that continues to ideologically underpin one of the most powerful strands of the Indian nationalist imaginary. A similar approach to Gurbani Kirtan would certainly open new avenues to rediscover a long-neglected tradition from a fresh perspective. The last part of my talk focuses on the decolonial notion of pluriversality applied to Gurbani musical literature. Just by going through the list of the ragas according to which the Sikh canonical text is structured, one can have an idea of the musical and the literary breadth of this repertory that, rooted in the medieval culture, developed in its unique way. In the comparison of the devotional raga-wise anthologies, Alan Miner notes that not only does the Guru Granth Sahib not follow the raga-ragini structure of the Vaishnava collections, but half of the ragas include forms not known in other traditions. Alan Miner noted that there is a clear continuity among these sets, but while Vaishnava collections are most closely related to the raga-ragini system, a number of ragas have been added to the Adi Granth collection. Many of the names are familiar from the later practice, but they never became part of the raga-ragini family groups. In the debate about the derivative nature of the Gursikh musical heritage from other core traditions, it must be considered that in the Guru Granth Sahib and in the Gurbani Parampara, there are ragas not known in the classical music. It should be also noted that the body of raga-based songs included in the Guru Granth Sahib reflects the multicultural ground of the pre-modern era Punjab and laid the foundation of a rich literature known for encompassing the voices of saint poets that were excluded from the orthodox Brahmanical Muslim religious narratives. Since the time of the Hindu Valley civilization, Punjab was the crossroad between two continents and the meeting point of diverse cultural, linguistic, and religious groups. I suggest that if we want to look at the influences in the Sikh musical literature, we have to reorient the search not according to a top-down hierarchy, but in a horizontal direction of parallel traditions interplaying, as also Peter Manuel has suggested. The Sikh gurus heard the voices of the other as songs echoing pluriversal values, forming them into compositions that could express the complexity of the truth as a multivocal symphony. I'm quoting Professor Bhogal. Guru Granth Sahib words calls for a resonance within and between traditions. This ecology of knowledges, to quote Santos de Souza, is well represented by several languages and Deshi regional ragas in which the liturgical hymns were remembered from the oral tradition. As Balbinder Singh Bhogal describes it, the body of songs included in the Guru Granth Sahib constitutes a comparative archive of multidirectional memories made of heterodox voices represented as equally legitimate. In the Guru Granth Sahib, for the first time, Bhakti and Sufi voices have been brought together in a comprehensive anthology of devotional padas. With its inclusive literature, the Guru Granth Sahib is the repository of some of the earliest written records of devotional poems, with an indication of the melodic setting, the raga, in which these songs were remembered. Among the heterodox voices included in the Guru Granth Sahib, the oldest is that of Jayadeva, the 12th century poet saint, author of the Gita Govinda. The second oldest author is the Punjabi saint Fariduddin Ganja Shekhar, also known as Baba Farid. But among all stands out the collection of Kabir's hymn in Brajvoli, set to 18 ragas, which is the earliest large anthology attributed to the saint from Varanasi. The presence of these authors, hailing from diverse areas and geographical areas, bears an exceptional witness to the pluriversal vision of the Sikh gurus, which is the foundation of Gurbani Kirtan. The inclusive nature of the Sikh scripture ultimately played an important part in the process of retaining the submerged memory of repertories sung across South Asia between the 12th and the early 17th centuries. In conclusion, the absence of Gurbani Kirtan from the musicological scholarship reveals the necessity of a more nuanced and inclusive history of South Asian music, in which Sikh culture does not stand as a derivative tradition, but as an ecosystem of knowledges whose study requires a decolonial approach, an interdisciplinary effort, and a sustained collaboration among musicologists and Sikh studies scholars. In 2019, to honor the 550th birth anniversary of Guru Nanak, Professor Bhogal and I organized a first interdisciplinary conference on the Sikh Guru's pluriversal vision, and this panel today is an ideal continuation of that conversation. And I leave now the virtual stage to Professor Balbinder Singh Bhogal. Let me stop sharing my screen and introduce Professor Bhogal. Dr. Balbinder Singh Bhogal is Professor of Religion and the holder of the Sardarni Kuljit Kaur Bindra Chair in Sikh Studies at Hofstra University, New York. His primary research interests are South Asian religions and cultures, specializing in the Sikh tradition, particularly the Guru Granth Sahib, its philosophy and exegesis. Secondary research interests are critical theory, political mysticism, decolonial, animal and affect studies. He has a huge number of essays that are available on academia.edu, and I invite you to check his page on academia.edu. Among his selected articles are Death and Dying in the Guru Granth Sahib, is forthcoming for the Sikh World Encyclopedia, Sikhism, Yoga and Meditation, Gursikh Dharam, for Routledge History of World Philosophies, The Fact of the Colonial Modernity and the Story of Sikhism, for Sikh Formations, and Decolonizations, Cleaving Gestures that Refuse the Alien Call for Identity Politics, that was published for Religions of South Asia. And now, without any delay, thank you very much, Professor Bhogal, for joining us today from Long Island, not too far from where I am. And I'm very happy and I'm very fortunate to be able to engage in a dialogue with a wonderful scholar as you are. So I'll mute my microphone now, and please.
Thank you so much, Professor Cassio. It's an honor to be invited to this forum and to share the stage with such august speakers. My talk should be about 15 minutes, 15, perhaps a little bit longer, and it's called A Decolonial Episteme, Seeing the Color of Thought. As Professor Cassio highlighted, that there's been a certain overlooking by scholarship, by the dominant narrative, overlooking of Gurbani Kirtan tradition. So I want to reverse the gaze and anthropologize the West for this talk. Two key aspects of Edward Said's thesis of Orientalism are that Western knowledge repeats its stereotypes of the East, and that this knowledge gets fixed as the essential truth of the other. Here I want to emphasize the problematic continuity of this repetition by charting a broader arc to include Orientalism's prehistory in medieval Europe's papal bulls and the production of monster races at the periphery of the European center. I have two heading quotes. The first is by George W.F. Hegel. Quote, "The first act by which Adam established his lordship over the animals is this, that he gave them a name." The second quote is by Jeffrey Cohen. "The act of naming is a controlling maneuver. A fixation is born of the twin desire to name that which is difficult to apprehend and to domesticate and therefore disempower that which threatens. Orientalism, the discourse of monster races and papal bulls, concern this domesticating power of language." So, this section is titled The Making of a Western Normative Order 1, Papal Bulls. Does thought have a color? If so, what color is it? If knowledge has a geography, then thought has a color. Thought took on the color of a particular race, a particular geography, and a particular religion. Thought became white Christian logic, and that logic was violent. Doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and the American exceptionalism. If not involving brutal assimilation, then genocidal annihilation, but also epistemicide, the destruction of indigenous epistemologies. The doctrine of discovery, formalized in the papal bulls of the 13th and 14th centuries and beyond, specified the entire world was under the jurisdiction of the Pope and as God's representative on the earth. Any land not Christianized, i.e. not under the sovereignty of a Christian ruler, could be possessed on behalf of God. All time and space was considered empty until Christians arrived with God's truth. Until then, it was terra nullius, an untamed wilderness and wildness. The bulls gave Columbus, Cortes, Pizarro, Cook, Hudson, and the rest both legal and moral license to do whatever they wanted to the peoples and lands they encountered, including dispossession, enslavement, and murder. They were granted, this is quoting one of the bulls, free and ample faculty to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and the other enemies of Christ whatsoever, whosoever, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. That was the Romanus Pontific of 1455. US legal doctrine is based on the doctrine of discovery. For example, in the 1835 Supreme Court case Tennessee versus Foreman, the court ruled, quote, "The principle declared in the 15th century as the law of Christendom, that discovery gave title to assume sovereignty over and to govern the unconverted natives of Africa, Asia, and North and South America, has been recognized as a part of the national law for nearly 4 centuries. Manifest destiny was a continuation of the doctrine of discovery, adapted to the needs of the 19th century US colonial aspirations. According to Paul Cavell, quote, today Christian imperialism is visible at every level of US foreign policy, from the concept of a cosmic battle between good and evil to a belief in our manifest destiny to bring various kinds of salvation to benighted peoples. As religious historian Andrew Pearson has extensively documented, quote, American foreign relations retained core features developed early on, not merely over decades, but down through the centuries. In the American context, this has often meant waging war in the name of God, or at least in the name of serving him and fulfilling his will. This is familiar rhetoric in the history of American exceptionalism, the stuff of providence, manifest destiny, the New Jerusalem, and the shining city upon the hill. Commonly paired with phrases manifest destiny and the same roots in crusades, the papal doctrine of Christian discovery, American exceptionalism, has been described as a pervasive faith in the uniqueness, immutability, and superiority of the country's founding liberal principles, accompanied by a conviction that the United States has a special destiny among nations. Thus, for thought to become white, it had to become law, as Professor Colin Dyan argues in her book titled The Law is a White Dog, How Legal Rituals Make and Unmake Persons. Monograph 2011. Through ongoing colonialism, white logic systematically domesticated, if not destroyed, different colors of thought, naming and classifying the other as irrational, inferior, fantastic, mythical, superstitious, childish, unself-conscious, useless, and unproductive, while it named itself the truth, liberty, emancipation, the real, rational, scientific, historical, useful, and productive. We can summarize two forms of Western othering. Spatial othering in terms of the monsters, infidels, heathens, and pagans. We'll talk about the monster races soon. And then Orientalism, which invokes a temporal othering, where the other is now not an infidel, but now a primitive, backward, underdeveloped, developing. So that's spatial othering and temporal othering. The making of a Western normative order, two monster races. Cathy Leveso writes on spatial othering of geography. The farther away a people lay from the center, the greater their perceived disenfranchisement from the Christian ecumeny. Beyond the Christian nations, at the heart of Mappamundi, the world maps, lay the Jews and the Muslims. Beyond the Jews, the Muslims lay the barbaric tribes. And beyond them, at the very edges of the world, lay the Plinian monstrous races. Center-periphery dynamics are going on here. So this is a spatial othering where classification is based on visible differences. As Michael Camille argues, the center is dependent upon the margins for its continued existence. Further, this unfolds an ongoing process of dependent differentiation. The monster races, also known as the marvels of the East, rather than existing out there as actual existential realities, quote, were called into existence in order to provide a basis of comparison through which their creators might exercise and exorcise their anxieties about their identities as Anglo-Saxons and as human beings. That is, through their extreme outlandishness, cast their creators as paragons of normality. Hence the emergence of a normative discourse. That was Asa Mittman I was quoting. Jeffrey Cohen writes an important essay in monster studies called Monster Culture 7 Theses. I'll just list the 7 theses because they're quite instructive for those who are familiar with the discourse of Orientalism. You'll hear resonances. Number 1, the monster's body is a cultural body. Number 2, the monster always escapes. 3, the monster is the harbinger of category crisis. 4, the monster dwells at the gates of difference. 5, the monster polices the borders of the possible. 6, Fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. 7. The monster stands at the threshold of becoming. We need only look at the first thesis, where Cohen writes, the monstrous body is pure culture, a construct and a projection. Summarizing Jeffrey Cohen's 7th thesis, Weinstock writes, quote, it takes a village to make a monster. That is to say, nothing or no one is intrinsically or naturally monstrous, because the monster's body is always pure culture, the embodiment of culturally specific fears, desires, anxieties, and fantasies. Though I do not have the space here to substantiate the continuity of the construction of the monster races with the Orientalist constructions of non-Christian races, I will simply cite Deborah Strickland, whose work seeks to, quote, explain how the monstrous races tradition contributed to the development of a medieval Christian concept of race, and to examine how it subsequently provided an enduring blueprint for the condemnation and exclusion of real-world non-Christian cultural outsiders. Focusing on the Middle Ages as a period that drew on ancient traditions, experienced especially acute Christian, non-Christian tensions, in turn established many tropes that have endured to the present day. I'm quoting Strickland again. It is an equally short conceptual step from walking, talking, well-dressed, if cannibalistic dogheads to medieval Christian characterization of Muslims known pejoratively as Saracens and characterized by some Christian chronicles as a race of dogs. The contemporary cultural reality in which Saracens and Tartars were excluded from medieval society based on both religious and physical differences invites us to consider not only the relationship between monstrosity and race, but also monstrosity and religion as a surrogate for race. She concludes, quote, the medieval monstrous races tradition provided a foundational forum for the expression of Christian fears and fantasies about cultural outsiders, notions that were inevitably overlaid onto actual human groups, to which the cases of Christian constructed Jews, Muslims, Mongols, and Black Africans clearly attest. The genius of the medieval system was that it never required the monsters to change. Indeed, the key to their diachronic utility was their constancy, as traced exactly in the same manner in the work of Edward Said. The making of a Western normative discourse. 3, Orientalism. It is odd that few have noted late the clear overlap and resonance across papal bulls, monster races, and the Oriental other, as Asa Mitter does notice the latter continuity. Discussing Said's Orientalism, which, quote, argues that the West identifies itself through a false vision of the East created by the West, Said's ideas overlap with and influence monster theory. He elaborates, quote, so many of the monsters in Western culture from classical through the early modern period come from the East, from Pliny, Cyapods, to Shakespeare's Caliban. I can elaborate those later if you like. The East was Europe's preferred setting for monsters, and Orientalism can help us understand why. Said's approach and conclusions are transferable to monster studies. And I would also add, vice versa. What this study reveals about the West's relationship with the East is an analog to our relationship with the monster. It is created by us. It tells us who we are by demonstrating what we are not. It does not speak for itself. It does not know itself like we know it or seek to know it. And it reminds the reader to look at the discourses on monsters, the theological, the scientific, the social, etc., in the text in which they appear. Again, I was quoting Mittman. Elsewhere, Mittman, discussing the monster races, writes, quote, indeed, while Edward Said might not explicitly address the medieval backstory to colonialism in his foundational 1978 text on Orientalism, the prehistory of Orientalism is there implicitly throughout. A year before Said's book, Patamita wrote his much maligned Monsters, 1977, discussing the overlap between Orientalism and monster studies. Patamita writes, quote, "There is one unique feature of ancient Indian culture that disturbed Western visitors to India, the multiple arms and heads of Hindu gods that Westerners identified as monstrous. A stereotypical image that drew upon two traditions, the classical one of monstrous races, that were supposed to live in India, and the terrifying Christian iconography of apocalyptic demons. The making of the Western normative discourse. 3, today's other. Weinstock charts the major shifts in the appearance of the monstrosity across contemporary times, in which he sees an important cultural shift away from appearance towards antithetical moral values, reconfigured as 1, the psychopath and the terrorist, 2, the faceless corporation or governmental agency, and 3, pertinent today, the virus that infects the social body, and 4, the revenge of an anthropomorphized nature. There is no time to elaborate this here. The violation of a singular story, knowledge of the academy as the power of Christian Europe. Immanuel Wallerstein, and now I'm coming more to the decolonial dimension of the paper. Immanuel Wallerstein says, at least 95% of all scholars and all scholarship from the period of the 1850 to 1914, and probably even to 1945, originates in 5 countries: France, Great Britain, the Germanys, the Italies, and the US. Gendered white European Christian men. With the colonial era, new sciences had to be conceived. Anthropology was invented to study the so-called primitive world, which comprised of people of the colonies of the 5 countries. Oriental studies was designed to cover everything other than Europe. Thus, though invisibilized through liberal rhetoric, this history reveals an obvious hierarchy of value and division of labor. Natural sciences deal with the objective world, most authoritative. Social sciences deals with the present secular social world. And the human sciences, history, anthropology, Oriental studies, ethnic studies, deals with the past, old religious, cultural worlds. Hegel's metaphysical imposition of religion as a mark of historical development, where spirit rises in the East but culminates in the European, German, Christian West, also shows this hierarchy of value. How Europeans constructed the idea of the self-same through their representations of the rest. So here, Christian Europe's management of difference by familiarizing the other via religion, race, etc., with its internal others, Judaism and Mohammedism, and its external others, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Taoism, Confucianism. As Tomoko Masazawa states, the invention of world religions was about how European universalism was preserved in the language of pluralism. Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism are neologisms created in the 19th and 20th century. They're not indigenous terms. That is why we have to move to the idea and the ideal of pluriversal, for this is not about how the West represents the rest, but how scholarship has disguised the West's regional location of enunciation so that it can appear neutral, objective, and universal. The approach here seeks to counter the reduction of Guru Nanak's vision, Ek Anek vision, the one many vision, to either a harbinger of modern relativism or an exemplar of a universalist theology. Indeed, universalism and relativism are recognized here as aspects of a single discourse, wherein the frames of multiculturalism and religion emerge as structures born of the colonial encounter, in which Christian nations mediated and negated the differences of indigenous traditions by an inclusive rhetoric of control and assimilation. Walter Mignolo has argued that modernity occluded the pluriversal under the pervasive discourse of the universal, such that the dominant groups, whether Christian whites or Hindu Brahmins, found themselves enjoying the epistemic privilege of classifying without being classified. That is, European universalism, the self-declared superiority of modern rationalism, Western progress, and Christian ethics, was masked and thereby preserved by the rhetoric of universalism on the one hand, God, democracy, reason, and pluralism on the other, tolerance, multiculturalism, freedom. This is nowhere more clearly illustrated than through the invention of world religions, as Masuzawa stated above. That the dominant power may choose to tolerate difference ensures that itself remains undisturbed in its singular command of the power of enunciation and representation. So many of the monsters in Western culture from classical through early modern period came from the East. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm about to conclude. Dispensing with European and Indic vertical notions of cosmic, linguistic, and ritual order, Guru Nanak's Ek Anek is both horizontally and temporally figured, and as such is inclusive of the other. When Guru Nanak sees no other Duja, this is not to say that all are one unified whole without remainder. Rather, it is a move firstly to resist the demarcation of the center, and secondly, the casting out of others beyond its periphery. Ek Anek is radically committed to inclusion, yet it just as radically disavows the politics of assimilation and opposes colonial epistemicide. It represents a pluriversal heterogeneity. So dismantling Western hegemony, ethical necessity of a new decolonial grammar, and I'll just go through a couple of the terms that are crucial for this shift. Pluriversal, what does that mean? The pluriversal is horizontal, bottom-up, and non-possessible. The universal is vertical and top-down and owned by a dominating group. The pluriversal emphasizes a particular relation of being with others as co-constitutive, heterogeneous, and collaborative. The universal particular operates through a master-slave relation that demands obedience, mimesis, and homogeneity. The former concerns experiential engagement, the latter swings from tolerance, the left, to zero tolerance, the right. While the pluriversal is intercultural and interepistemic, the universal is neither. Second, the colonial historical difference, rather than the focus on cultural difference. Here we have the binaries that post-colonial studies has talked about for a long time: the civilized over the barbaric, the invention of history to displace myth, the beginnings of religion in magic, race and blood theory, reason displacing faith, modernity displacing tradition, etc. And the notion of a first world and developed nations, second world, developing nations, third world, undeveloped nations continues this binary of the dominant discourse. The colonial historical difference is assumed as naturally occurring rather than the result of the violence of colonization and the coloniality of power. Dipesh Chakrabarti says, European thought is at once both indispensable and inadequate in helping us to think through the experience of political modernity in non-Western nations. And provincializing Europe becomes a task of exploring how this thought may be renewed from and for the margins. To an aid in anthropology of the West from the global South, a new conceptual vocabulary has been has begun to be minted by pointing out the distinction between cultural difference and colonial difference. Minolo suggests that problematic issues cannot be dealt with by restricting the discourse solely to the former. In this regard, cultural difference is an invention of modern imperial discourses that function by hiding the power differential that justifies exploitation, control, and domination of one sector of the population over the other. The currency of cultural difference in today's discourse of multiculturalism arguably masks the colonial difference, which unapologetically names the root of racism and racialization. Thus, Minolo argues cultural difference calls for relativism, while colonial difference calls for liberation from epistemic imperial powers. Minolo's colonial difference and Chakrabarty's historical or subaltern difference both name an epistemological shift key for an ethical reanalysis of colonial and post-colonial histories, and for questioning European modes of narration, particularly those that claim universality. Third, the coloniality of power. Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Cuanjo names the coloniality of power a global hegemonic model of power in place since the conquest that articulates race, labor, space, and peoples according to the needs of capital and to benefit of white European peoples. This then reveals an important difference between colonialism and coloniality, the former being a particular expression of the latter. Global coloniality is not therefore reducible to the presence or absence of colonial administration. Grossvogel elaborates, quote, "The heterogeneous and the multiple global structures put in place over a period of 450 years did not evaporate with the juridical political decolonization of the periphery over the past 50 years. We continue to live under the same colonial power matrix. With juridical political decolonization, we have moved from a period of global colonialism to the current period of global coloniality." For Grossvogel, coloniality foregrounds the continuity of colonial forms of domination after the end of colonial administrations produced by colonial cultures and structures, whereas coloniality of power refers to a crucial structuring process in the modern colonial world system that articulates peripheral locations in the international division of labor. This is my last page. Dispensing with European and Indic vertical notions of cosmic, linguistic, and ritual order, Guru Nanak's Ek Anek, one many, is both horizontally and temporally figured, and as such inclusive of the other. Oh, that's why that happened. I printed incorrectly. Yeah, I was just ending with that. I've already read that passage, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhogal. And I would like to invite on our virtual stage the 13th generation vocalist exponent of Gurbani Sangeet, Bhai Baldeep Singh. Bhai Baldeep Singh is a pioneering polymath in cultural conservation who renounced his flying career to revitalize the tangible and intangible wealth of South Asia, with a particular focus on the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara. In service of his Herculean mission, Bhai Baldeep Singh serves variously as kirtania, percussionist, scholar, luthier, poet, scholar, filmmaker, teacher, activist, politician, web series host, and nonprofit head of the Anand Foundation in New Delhi, where he is joining us from. Please.
Thank you, Francesca, and greetings to everyone present. I'm glad that this conversation is happening. It's lovely to see Peter as well. And I have been sort of occupied with the publication of my book, which is sort of a first summary, not the last. I hope I get a chance to continue writing. The first summary of about 34 years of field work. The book now, never ending, it's almost 2,200 pages, sort of split in 6 parts. I have put together some thoughts in the last 23 hours. which I'm about to share with you. In fact, it is my pleasure to share. I'm very with a lot of interest. I've heard the previous two papers. I'm very glad that some of these important markers are being set for this conversation. What I'm going to, the journey I'm going to take you is a little different. So I'm not coming from the decolonial, I'm neither a tool maker of the decolonial perspective, nor a user of those tools. So as Francesca has alluded briefly, that I renounced my flying career to, as I was hearing from the last memory bearers, that the traditions, the knowledge and the memory was about to die. So I renounced everything to recover the memory. So, which I think clubbed me, yes, amongst the very few conservators of the intangible heritage. Being married to an Italian from Napoli, I was also introduced to the native Neapolitan language and the music, which is again non-Christian. So it, raised other ideas of the idea of coloniality in Europe itself. That everything was not just Christian or Pope. There were things which were multi-layered, etc. So I'm coming from a journey, sharing with you from my fieldwork of recovering the intangible wealth and some tangible assets from the Gursikh Parampara, Gurbani Kirtan or Gurbani Sangeet. Gurbani Kirtan being the act of singing. Gurbani Sangeet includes all the allied fields, including instrument making, the repertoire, the playing of the instruments, etc. The pedagogy even. Gurbani Kirtan is just the act of singing Bani. So when you talk of raga, tal structures, that's part of Gurbani Sangeet. That's how the ancient term has been used. So I wrote as the first note, the header I wrote today was Chasing the Memory of the Uncolonized Gursikh. That the tradition of Gurbani Sangeet was not documented or studied is a proof itself that the invaders and other suspicious wanderers in Punjab, in the old historical and the geographical Punjab, which is now split in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, a bit of Tibet, etc. So that Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir is the north, the Rag Purvi, which means easterly, is the Purv of Punjab, is a land where Vedas were written. So this narrative, people have never, because there were no Punjabi scholars, I guess, in the last decades to really redefine what are you studying from, where does it come from, except a mere theoretical footnote, people didn't realize. So Purvi is an easterly or eastern melody or melodic structure. It is the east of Punjab. It is east of India would be Bengal and Assam. But Vrindavan and Mathura is the easternmost boundary of Punjab, the banks of Yamuna. So that is how the term Purbi even comes, the one from the east. That's the extent of the east, Rag Multani and etc. So when I speak of Punjab, it is that historical and the geographical area which is divided into as many countries and regions and states within these countries. That the tradition of, if I may repeat the line which I almost finished, that the tradition of Gurbani Sangeet was not documented or studied is a proof itself that the invaders and other suspicious wanderers within the Punjabi territories and often plunderers were unable to breach the core center of the protected heritage of the Gursikh Panth or Marg, or the path, that the knowledge remained uncolonized. That the newly freed Sikhs will have no understanding of the value of the intangible wealth safe kept by the uncolonized Sikhs came as a shocker. Subsequent to the partition of India in 1947, most excellence bearers died in a blanket of anonymity, if I may, in the years and decades after. I was the only one from the last two generations to plug in with the memory of the last remaining masters since the 1980s. Gurbani, unlike Hindustani Sangeet or Carnatic Sangeet or Rabindra Sangeet, was sung across South Asia. 36 authors, which Francesca has mentioned, the oldest being Bhagat Jayadeva. I could not find in my researches any of his compositions, but I have recovered two of the original compositions of Baba Sheikh Farid in Rag Suhi, which are almost 850 years old, if not more. And he is the second oldest author, only 3 years younger to Bhagat Jayadeva, born in 1173. It is claimed that there are two musical terms in the header of almost all musico-poetic compositions, such as Pade, Toke, and Chant and Gurbani. These are the terms. These are the term rag and the raga name, and the term ghar, the later being oft associated with the tal measure or rhythmic cycle. In my family alone, my two granduncles had two different beliefs about the term ghar. Bhai Gurcharan Singh, born 1915, he passed away in 2017 at the age of the young age of 102. The elder of the two brothers believed the term was a reference to the tal cycle, while the younger brother, Bhai Avtar Singh, 1926, passed away in 2006, thought that it was not. Prince Mrigendra Singh of the erstwhile Sikh kingdom of Patiala also associated the term with the rhythm cycles. When I had pressed him on providing the information with regards to the 17 ghars that were used in Gurbani, he was unable to do so. The entire exchange was video recorded as I was in New York to record him as part of the oral history project of the Anath Foundation in New Delhi. Since the later 1980s, I've interviewed and heard several theories on the subject of ghar. A portion of the findings were shared by me in the 2001 Amrit Kaur Ahluwalia lecture series in Sikhism, hosted by the Center of South Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. I have appended, and later on, whenever needed, that I would just give a passing reference to that. Since my 2001 CSAS lecture, many others have attempted to interpret and decipher the meaning of ghar, presenting many more theories. For example, by presenting a paper at the Hofstra University in 2008, Dr. Indrajit Kaur shared an assumption that a ghar was in fact a raga variant, while in his book, Dr. Charan Kamal Singh proposes that ghar is simply the count of hidden commas in the Bani text. All of these scholars, musicians and musicologists who have cogitated and subsequently hypothesized on the meaning of the term ghar have one thing in common. They do not have the original meaning, which should have only been possible if they had either studied from a memory bearer of the tradition of Gurbani Sangeet, an exegete, or a written source authored by someone who held a strain of affinity with the memory-bearing elders. They're all riding the hermeneutical curve. That is, they are assuming, interpreting, and or estimating. Only when one has lost the connection with the memory of a particular subject or a topic, one is compelled to ride the hermeneutic curve. Although it is necessary to make the scholars of the field aware about the theories, about all theories that have or are being applied and or explored, it is also important to avoid presenting guesstimates as fact. Every theory, once presented, even if prematurely, attracts practitioners, followers, and believers, in spite of a theory's shortcomings or inability to answer all mandatory questions or aspects. The field of Gurbani Sangeet must learn to sift the proposers from the researchers. An ideal researcher, speaking from the perspective of the indigenous pedagogical processes, is someone who studies and analyzes knowledge and or knowledge systems that have survived through time to the present. A proposer, on the other hand, is someone who attempts to invent a new wheel or create a new tradition or a knowledge system. Then the thorny ornament of ego appears in defense of the newly constructed theory. The consciously delimited scope of my research and analysis to find or search Bhal, that is, the original compositions, pedagogical tools and methods, practices and observances, the instruments that were either used in the presence of the authors of Guru Granth Sahib or designed and or modified by them and or their disciples along with their literary skills, playing technique, and repertoire. There has been so much work to do in this regard that I have yet to create my own systems to compensate for lost knowledge and missing links. In the post-colonial era, the music across the regions in South Asia was not only connected but represented a musical-literary conversation which was done both contemporaneously and in retrospect. The music and the musical lures of the colonial era, including reaching some sort of unanimity or similarity, also has the same feature. Now, this is very interesting what I've shared. What is contemporaneous and across or in retrospect? Let's say there is a composition that is sung by Baba Sheikh Farid, and he uses similes or concepts and presents one aspect of a conversation. Guru Nanak responds 3 centuries later to that particular composition of Baba Sheikh Farid. For example, if Baba Sheikh Farid sings, Jal jasi dhola hath na laye kasumbada. This is from the Golden Temple tradition. We have the original of Baba Sheikh Farid as well. Hath na laye kasumbada. Bhar Jal jasi dhola hath na laye kasumbada. बेड़ा बांध न सके बेड़ा बांध न सके बंधन की वेला हाथ न लाए कसुंबड़ा. He's talking of the passage of time, that this is the moment, and that when the ocean comes, you won't have a boat to fathom across or to traverse across, etc., that you don't lose time. He says once the milk comes out of the breast, it can't go back in. So he's talking of lost opportunities. Whereas Guru Nanak, so that people don't mistake that it's somehow in a composition of depression, no, it's a warning. So he says, because Baba Sheikh Farid refers to the color, the non-fast color of Kasumbada. Guru Nanak speaks of the fast color of Majitha. So, Tera eko nam Majithada, Rata mera chola, Tera eko nam, etc. So, this is what I'm referring to as compositions between the authors of Gurbani. There has been a contemporaneous dialogue and there has been a dialogue in retrospect. There was a connection. So even now, when we are fighting with the corruption, or you impose the Hindustani system, now the Bhatkanda system on the rest of the India, there was similar conversations also in the past. That's how you find Rag Bhairo in so many traditions across Asia. We have to be intelligent how we use systems. When we must venture into the territory of conservation of the intangible heritage. Otherwise, ordinary people say, why should I bother in learning the old systems? Is what I'm alluding to. That there were connections in the pre-colonial era is represented by the very construct of the multi-authored Guru Granth Sahib, first edition by the 5th Sikh Guru Arjan Dev in 1604 AD, and the second edition by the 10th Sikh Guru Gobind Singh in 1708 AD, and the Gurbani contained within. The story of the term raga stated in the header of the most pade, tuke, etc. is exactly the same. In spite of the understanding that true rag forms of old ragas can be ascertained only by the Drupad or Dhurpad compositions composed between the 15th and the 19th centuries, the Rag Nirnay Committee, it was a committee, those who do not know, there was a committee in 1991 which brought several musicians, mostly khayal singers, tappa or ghazal or folk singers, some ragis who had no history of learning the traditional knowledge. They were told to create the ragas which they did not know. So they did not have the humility to learn from the last remaining memory bearers, but they put together, started constructing. But when you look at the parameters set by the Hindustani classical musicians, and there are debates now which are public on, I'm addressing in one of the papers, my keynote address, which I'm to submit to Balbinder and Francesca from the seminar they hosted in 2019. I've gone in detail about what I've transcribed some of the conversations with some of the greatest Indian classical musicians were the conversations they were having in the 1950s and early 60s for the All India Radio. Even there is a reiteration that, for example, Rag Malhar, they say that only if we find an original Drupad of Rag Malhar, which is they say, we don't have a Drupad in this rag, so we will not believe that this is an old raga. One of the scholars whom I'm quoting says, this was the Muslim singers. In India, there was only Rag Megh. Rag Megh is again pentatonic, but does not have the sixth sharp. It has the seventh flat instead of the sixth, that is the Dhaivata, doesn't exist. So, sa re ma pa ni sa ni pa ma re ni re sa. They said this is the Hindu raga. These Muslims keep this. I'm trying to emulate or copy the sarcasm which this gentleman is saying. There's a recording on the YouTube. He said, these Muslims, they corrupted it. Now, this gentleman doesn't know that Rag Malhar, Drupads exist in the Gurbani Sangeet tradition, and they are pre-Darbari music, which is the constitution of the Hindustani Sangeet, right? And there's a composition, Guru Arjan Dev, from which my granduncles have notated published by the Punjabi University in 1979, Hey Gobind, Hey Gopal, Hey Dayal Lal, and just the asthai goes like this. Hey Gobind, Hey Gopal, hey, goes on like that. Then there is, for example, ragas like Rag Gond. They sing Rag Gond Malhar, like God. My very first conversation, the first debate I had with Pandit Rajan Sajan Mishra in 89 or 90 in a college at Speak-Make event at Ludhiana, where my aunt was the principal. They sang Rag Gond Bilawal. So afterwards, when we were introduced, I said, hey, I spoke, and we are very close, Pandit Raj. Sadly, we just recently lost Pandit Rajan Mishra to COVID. Both the brothers, they were very young. I was also young. And I said, you sang Gond Bilawal. That's very interesting. How is it different from Rag Gond from Bilawal Gond? So the prefix and the suffix. And we had a wonderful debate at the time. And that was late 80s, sir. Then there is Maru Bihar. People sing in Indian class with Maru Bihar, but they have no idea what Maru is. When I spoke with my very dear friend Bahauddin Dagar, the son of the legendary Zia Mohiuddin Dagar, I asked him, so how do you sing Rag Maru? He says, his father and few others have reverse engineered Rag Maru. They say we remove Bihag from Maru Bihag, so we think this is Maru. But I said, what about the shared notes? Who were to tell you? There were certain notes that were shared with it. Then he was, there was a catch-22 situation. And I sang him the original Maru from the Gurbani Sangeet tradition. Jeevan Padavi Pai Ab Mohe Jeevan Padavi Pai. This is just the Asthayan, the first line of the Asthayan Dhurpad of Tal Chanchal, 14-beat slow tempo. Modern day musicians or musical Hindustani Sangeet say, Chanchal is a light tal, and it's only used for light singing, light music. These are Dhurpads in slow tempo Chanchal, to speak of ignorance, glorified ignorance. Maru is one. Then you have Rag Gond, for example. Compositions that exist in the Gurbani Sangeet systems are Bhagat Namdev's early 15th century compositions, two of them. and pure gone, extraordinary composition. And there's a very beautiful blend of this, which my granduncle, before he died at the age of 102, he passed on that composition to me. And this composition, when I'm singling out, it starts from below. The normal compositions, they start from etc. This one is very unique. Prabhu Subhak Hom Kahiyo Prabhu Subhak Hom Kisuna Pran Rak Hom, etc. Likewise, there are many other ragas. Shud Basant, for example. The Hindustani Sangeet has no memory of that. Gurbani Sangeet, the fact that it predates the Dari music, has a memory which I think Hindustani Sangeet will gain a lot between that. Ragana committee was trying to create new ragas, which according to the parameters of how compositions from the medieval of between the 13th, 14th to 19th century Dhrupads, they help identify the forms of the ragas. Without them, they say that you cannot claim that this rag has this form or not. Likewise, new instruments with new stringing styles and newly managed playing techniques are being propagated as the originals played by the Sikh gurus. But what about the colonization underway? The decolonial and post-colonial academic lenses have their utility, but as an exponent and conservator of the tradition in question, I would stress the more urgent and critical need to collate and analyze the memory of the uncolonized or sovereign Gursikhs who never laid down their arms and munitions, nor shook hands with the colonizers, successfully saved the intangible assets endowed by the gurus, as well as the intra-panthic or intra-Maghi histories, narratives, and tales of valor. Lifetime-wise, I'm so overwhelmed without any public support, writing down and notating all that I've been able to harness from the last memory bearers, most of whom I had discovered and recovered from the mandala of anonymity, if I may, that I'm unable to check all the distortions, half-truths, fictions, and appropriations of the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara. The field has become a victim at the hands of those who pose as its saviors on one hand, but concoct convenient fictions in its name, and even in the name of the gurus. The legitimacy-seeking corruptors aren't very many, but they have thrived for years now, for many well-known and not so reluctant scholars and uninformed Sikh leaders have been their patrons. These ambitious fiction writers are quite sly, presenting a most genial demeanor to the unsuspecting public. They touch up their true intent with the powder of humility and color of purpose, thus charming the patrons in order to gain that straw of legitimacy under whose guise they peddle their fictitious claims to the minds and hearts of innocent seekers who are simply eager to learn of the Guru's endowments. This too is colonization and conversion at play in our era. To construct an analogy, these are times when rotting corpses of whales, big lies that is, are sold as organic apples. Guru's actual histories, if I may, to the uninformed, joyous bidders. There have been no contemporaneous attempt to not only prevent this cancer from growing, but to inform those who have fallen prey to these misinformation and disinformation campaigns. This is a new attempt to colonize and gain territory. The methodologies employed by these new age colonizers is eerily similar to, or exactly like the colonial times, when those who sought to liberate the illegally annexed Indic lands from the coercing invaders were branded as terrorists, and those who refused to accept the colonization were dismissed as some old age illiterates who do not understand the laws of evolution. Today, those who question the fiction writers are being branded and dismissed as some angry, egotist, jealous, uninformed, and out of sync fools. My longest question, therefore, to the panelists and to the learned attendees. How can a near-extinct tradition respond to such attempts where the contemporary creations, both of music as well as fictional histories are not only equated with the memory of the persecuted and disenfranchised people who ceded all their tangible holdings, lived in the jungles, exile, and unmarked territories for decades and centuries, yet safeguarded the intangible endowments of the Gursikh gurus, but also sold as more authentic and righteous. On May 13, 2018, there was a near-fatal attack on the only attempt to recover and re-establish the cultural traditions at a thematically chosen locale of Sultanpur Lodi, Punjab. The Punjab police, India, mostly Sikhs, imagine, at the behest of the local and state-level Sikh politicians, destroyed priceless and irreplaceable musical instruments, looted almost all the assets, including dated stencils, manuscripts of religious and cultural significance, luthiery tools of three important luthiers of the 20th century, tools that I had designed and purchased since 1989, and used to revive almost all lost instruments of Gurbani Sangeet tradition. Is this not continued colonization? Colonization does not end with the exit or demise of the colonizer or colonizers. Colonization can only end when the instruments of colonization that was set in motion by the colonizers are bared and then clinically dismantled, affording public space for vernacular traditions noteworthy for centuries of fertility to ennoble our consciousness and culture once more. Recovering the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara, lastly, a tradition cannot claim to be distinct without stating what it was. What was its purpose? What was its pedagogical process? While recovering the Gurbani Sangeet tradition and in trying to save from extinction, I was able to recover the following heritage assets that clearly define it and help its uniqueness and demonstrate an independent understanding of elements necessary for any ragic musical system. First being the Sankhya Vidhi, the pedagogical process. 1770 is the oldest encyclopedic rag Dhrupad of Sargams, and I have researched plenty with Professor S.R. Janaki Raman, Professor Ramanathan in the South, and other Hindustani exponents. The oldest one written by Baba Gurmukh Singh in 1770s, Rag Bilawal Dev Gandhari. And if I may try and share that with you all quickly, just to show you the text only. This is part of the, there's a sixth addendum in my upcoming book. This is so I've written these down. Here it is. Anyway, I'll come to that. So this is one. Baba Gurmukh Singh's Rag Tika. Then there is Baba Surpat Singh, who wrote a Rag Malkauns Tika in 1780, approximately. The other one was Devagandhari Bilawal, which goes something like this. This Asthai. And the Malkauns Tika by Surpat Singh is and then Sur Mandali, which incidentally had showed up on when I was trying to share with you. Sur Mandali is very interesting. Normally people say, oh, 7-note permutation combinations are 5040. But the entire pedagogy system is not there. The first part is the archic, which is only a single note. You will hear tales, for many years, the masters would tell us only to do sa, sa, etc. But they don't have the actual notings. So from the memory, I sat down one day and I started writing. This is the Gathic Jati, 2 notes, combination, sa, re, re, sa, etc. I know that we have a limited aspect. And then just to give you title, this is in my book. In fact, I've requested Peter to write a note as well for it. Samajati is a combination of 3 notes. And there are how many combinations would you be able to make? And these are 210. So these are very, this is how the tradition, Gursikh tradition has taught us. And the way I write, this is the first 24 of the 4 notes. And I don't have to read the This is the first of the 24. And these are the 4-note combinations which go on until 838 is the count. And this one. And then the 5-note combinations begin, order of Jati. So I have, people only tokenism, 7 notes, 7 notes, 7 notes. But people forget there are 1,620 of the 5-note combinations. And these are just written from memory. Then you start the Kaur of Jati, the 6-note combinations. Now, people, have forgotten that 6-note combinations are also 5,040. They are not less. And then, of course, there are the 7-note ragas. The scale systems. In the south, of course, you have the 72 male kartas, the scales, ragic scales. In north, the Bhakhanda system is, they say it's 10 thoughts are now established. But I wrote the Rag Bijak in my upcoming book for the Guru Nanak University and published by record label, and Ekau Male and Raga Melas. I've written, okay, let me just show you the count that this is wild.
We can delve.
Francesca, I'm mindful. I'm almost
we have
done.
only half hour left, and Nirinjan has to do her presentation, and then I would like to invite questions. So maybe we can delve into these details with questions. And
So this Sankiran, Sarv Sankiran Mela is the 2,466th scale that I have written. And Surmandali, then Rag, Thought, and Mela have mentioned improvisation systems were different. Instruments I've already mentioned. Eclectic musical ambit of Gurbani is one, and riches of the Tal structures and complex use, is unique. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Bhai Sahib, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would like to give space also to our attendees.
We will talk about that later.
Okay. And by the way, before I introduce the next presenter, Nirinjan Kaur Khalsa Baker, I would like to invite the attendees to think about questions. You can type the questions in the chat, but I think it's easier at this point if you just unmute. Since this is a small gathering, and especially I would request Professor Manuel, if you would like to comment and say something, would be very precious for us, your comments. Nirinjan Kaur Khalsa Baker is Senior Instructor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University, where she also serves as Clinical Professor in Jain and Sikh Studies. And Acting Director of Graduate Yoga Studies. Her ethnographic research and publications investigate historic, modern, and transnational Sikh Kirtan. Using a decolonial lens, she explores questions around diversity in Sikh identity, pedagogy, and practice. Throughout her scholarship and teaching, she highlights the importance of embodied practices to cultivate ethical action in daily life. She currently serves as co-chair of the Sikh Studies Unit at the American Academy of Religion. And Nirinjan ji, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So wonderful to be with everyone here today. And I'm just going to jump in. And thank you, Francesca, Dr. Cassio, for organizing this really important panel. I'm going to share my screen. So just bear with me for one moment. Okay. Are you seeing my whole desktop?
I see the desktop,
Yes.
and in the middle, right at the center, I see the PowerPoint.
Okay. Let me know if it plays the PowerPoint.
We don't see anything now.
Now it was removed.
Okay. I will share again. Do you just see the PowerPoint now?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. The title of my talk is The Gurbani Sangeet Parampara, a pedagogy that decolonizes the Sikh self. This paper looks to the memory, pedagogy, and practice of the Sikh musical tradition, the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara, to contend that it has historically resisted both colonial and reformist attempts to homogenize Sikh music identity. Instead, it offers a transformative pedagogy, a dynamic living process that decolonizes the self toward a sovereign identity. Brazilian liberation theologian Paulo Freire, from his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, addresses how the educative process may serve divergent purposes. He says, education either functions as an instrument that is used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. When studying the spiritual aesthetic pedagogy of the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara, it becomes important to ask whether the purpose of the educative process is to integrate the next generation into the logic of the present and demand conformity to it, or is it to give them the means to deal critically and creatively with their present circumstances and bring about personal and communal transformation? As the world is awakening to the ways in which white Christian supremacy, imperialism, ethno-nationalism, and patriarchy have colonized our cultural thought, praxis, and pedagogy, this becomes a critical question. For over 20 years, I have dedicated myself to learning the oldest surviving percussion tradition of Punjab, the Amritsari Kapurthala Bhaj, on the Geordie Pakhavij, from its Pagadi Nasheen, the head of the tradition, Bhai Baldeep Singh, who just spoke. He honored me as its first female.
We only see one slide, and it's the number 48 with the Raj Academy. I don't know why it's happening, but I know that you prepared.
Oh, okay. I see the issue. Thank you so much for letting me know that.
Sorry for interrupting you, but I know.
No, I appreciate it. I'm sorry I'm having
PowerPoint
technical issues here. Okay, let's try that again. There we go.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so wonderful. Oh. This is all we had missed. It is important to know, so Bhai Baldeep Singh had honored me as the first female exponent, and he shared with me that it's important to know where the lineage comes from. It's important to ask if we are merely interpreting music or if we are knowledgeable recipients of the tradition. Studying within this pedagogic system has given me an insight into the holistic self-understanding of Sikh thought, which has continued to inform my own Sikh studies scholarship and practice over the past 15 years. It has demonstrated to me the centrality of embodied experiential methodologies as ways to reorient and liberate our minds colonized by hegemonic sociocultural and religious conditioning. Rather than shackling diverse praxis into a normative standard, it roots itself in a mode of scholarship that honors the past so that the future may flourish. From my own research, education, and experience with the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara, I have found that the orally transmitted knowledge resists both colonial and reformist attempts to homogenize and calcify Sikhi into a stagnant identity. It is through the memory, pedagogy, and practice of the parampara that the Sikh path can be embodied as a dynamic, living stream of knowledge that continually decolonizes the self. Decolonial pedagogy of the parampara. Historically, Sikh music, composition, singing, playing, and luthier techniques were honored as part of the Guru's intangible heritage, and their memory bearers were heralded as their trusted guardians. However, the 18th century British colonization of India caused significant loss of traditional systems of knowledge and change within the genre. Since the times of the Sikh Gurus, musical knowledge was transmitted from teacher to student. After the Sikh Guru era, 3 primary institutions of learning or taksals were established to produce exponents of the tradition, the oldest being in Amritsar. Between 1765 and 1833, on the walkway surrounding the Golden Temple in Amritsar, there were more than 70 bungas belonging to individuals and communities as places to house pilgrims or as places of learning. However, in the 20th century, the bungas were demolished, due in large part to the effects of colonization. The British removed patronage that had previously supported knowledgeable Vidwans or master teachers and centers of learning throughout the Punjab and replaced them with British-run educational institutions. Thomas Macaulay, a British historian and politician, was largely responsible for introducing Western education in India. In his Minute on English Education, he describes the civilizing mission of British colonial education, whose purpose is to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. In response to shifting patronage and colonial education, a new generation of Indians trained in Anglo vernacular schools adopted colonial logics and methodologies of interpretation and translation to reform cultural and religious institutions through a process of erasure. In a 2011 interview, Principal Diyal Singh of the Gurmat Vidyala Music School shared the lack of care taken to preserve and safeguard Sikh heritage. He states, he was speaking in Punjabi. This is translation. The ancient music training centers were run by the knowledgeable ones. In 1925, the SGPC was created and began to manage the Gurdwaras. The election system came in the Dharma. Those people had no knowledge of Gurbani or Sangeet, but were all about money and power. They didn't pay much attention to the music in the Guru's way. The older masters passed away and there weren't any new educated people to take over. The Gurdwaras are getting money from the donations and they're not using it towards teaching Gurbani Sangeet nor doing research. The tradition bearers used to love Sangeet, do research and practice on their own. This is all over now, end quote. Due to the significant loss of musico-religio-cultural knowledge, practices, and memory, a Sikh Renaissance began in the 1990s to revive pre-colonial epistemologies and praxis. My research on this Renaissance has revealed divergent approaches to the revival, including reformist attempts, much like those seen during the 18th and 19th century British colonization, to use Western logics of interpretation and dissemination to mold Sikh praxis into normative frameworks based on modern identity politics. Specifically, there have been contemporary reformist attempts to institutionalize and standardize a classical and independent form of Sikh music referred to as Gurmat Sangeet to be taught at universities in India. Additionally, there have been neo-traditional attempts to revive what is perceived as an ancient musical and aesthetic purity, not by accessing the lived memory of the parampara, but instead through new interpretations that both codify Sikh praxis based on textualist readings and create new histories. Additionally, these reformist attempts to revive Sikh music have in turn erased the complex diversity of the pre-colonial genre, causing misinterpretations and a loss of intangible knowledge and wisdom. Baldeep Singh notes how, I quote, a lack of academic integrity has now polluted the field, where the contemporary are being equated with the traditional. In the last 4 decades, newer ROG forms have emerged, which have been marketed as more authentic than the ROG forms as remembered by the tradition bearers. And this goes for the instruments as well. Beginning in the late 1980s, Baldeep Singh undertook painstaking research to excavate the musical knowledge, memories, genealogies, and oral histories from elders born at the turn of the century, because intangible knowledge must be learned by the next generation or it becomes extinct. Trained in the oral tradition as a historian and memory bearer of the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara, he argues that while much has been lost and is in need of preservation, it is also a resilient, living stream of knowledge. Those who embody the intangible heritage as vidvans or knowledgeable bearers become living books. As a living force, the epistemology, pedagogy, and praxis of the Parampara is not stagnant nor confined to any one orthopraxic definition. It allows for freedom and flexibility because the vidvans are critical scholar practitioners who responsibly maintain the memory, pedagogy, and praxis, the knowledge of which allows for interpretive freedom. In this way, Baldeep Singh refers to the Parampara as an uncolonized pedagogy, which I interpret as meaning it provides an uncolonized logic that has remained open and resilient, even through the socio-political pressures of the colonial era. As the decolonial scholar Mignolo maintains, de-Westernization and decoloniality emerged from the energies, knowledges, beliefs, and praxis of living that were never destroyed. And that quote comes also from a book, a chapter in a book that both Dr. Cassio and I had worked on. In order for intangible knowledge to survive, they must be responsibly taught, learned, and imbibed. Today, there remains a dearth of those who have studied the Gurbani Sangeet Parampara. Although a great amount has been lost, remaining memory bearers work to recover, preserve, reconstruct, disseminate, and thus revive the Parampara's pedagogic methodologies that teach the ancient Shabad repertoire, raga forms, voice culture, classical instrument playing, and luthier luthieri techniques, as seen here in this image where Baldeep Singh has hand-carved this rabab that he's holding, and then also here the taus. In addition to the musical memory and techniques, the pedagogic methodologies of the Parampara teach a particular logic to analyze, understand, and interpret, remember, and reconstruct Sikh knowledge over time. It gives students the tools to excavate knowledge, to analyze, sing, and create their own embodied expressions, and through their own gnosis become sovereign authorities, vidvans, or living books. Within the teacher-student Guru Shishya Parampara educative process, teachers repeat the same thing over and over until the student is able to recite it back as accurately as possible to the teacher's satisfaction, whether in the moment or in future renditions. The use of repetition within the Parampara is not limited to musical instruction, but also occurs through storytelling and lectures. Through the oral pedagogic process, traditional knowledge and logics are constantly re-enunciated, repeated, remembered. Within the self, through years of training and experience, which encultures a spiritual aesthetic, habitus of listening, taken from Judith Becker, and a gnosis. In other words, the pedagogic methodology teaches a particular logic that enables the practitioner to become part of a living stream of knowledge, an epistemic ecology that creates the past and creates the future as embodied bearers of living memory. In this way, and I'm concluding now, in this way, the Parampara pedagogic process continually dialogues with the otherness of the past, thus emancipating itself from those modern apparatuses that create what Gerald Bruns refers to as a ruthless forgetting and an epistemological break with what is perceived as the strangeness of the past. Rather than forgetting and breaking with tradition or being closed to difference and change, Parampara pedagogy offers a living hermeneutic, a relational movement between past and present as an ever-expansive horizon of creativity and self-transformation. The liberating effects of this practice is expressed by Baldeep Singh, who states, I quote, "Kirtan does not make you a musician, it makes you a sadhu, a mystic. It propels you from the realm of the self-centered ego to the unity between self and other." The Gurbani Sangeet Parampara offers an experiential methodology through its memory and pedagogy that allows the practitioner to embody the spiritually insightful Bani hymns through affective musical modes. This embodied practice is understood as a process which offers enlightening knowledge that illuminates ignorance, liberates the mind from colonization and habitual conditioning, transforming how we think, speak, and act in the world, from a sovereign state of knowing and being, beyond the oppositional logic of ego consciousness, toward a communion with all others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalsa, for this enlightening presentation. I would like to open the floor to questions, and you can raise your virtual hand or your actual hand. Let me put the gallery so we can actually see us. You can also put on your screen if you like. And are there questions? I invite questions. Nice to see all the new friends. Gustavo Moura is doing a PhD, is working on his PhD dissertation on Kirtan in diaspora and in the Americas. If you have questions, Peter, we would welcome your comments or questions. Hi, Peter, yes, and then Gustavo.
I don't have anything deep to say. I'm just a student in all this, but I really enjoyed the presentations and also what I've been reading, publications by Baldeep Ji and Francesca, of course, and Nirinjan's dissertation. And I've been interested in the rags and getting to know, at least via YouTube or whatever, some of the whatever performances of rags are there, whether they are correct and authentic or not, I don't know. But it would be interesting. It seems to me one way if the colonization could be resisted, the way that some Hindustani vocalists nowadays are taking interest in the Pushti Marg repertoire of rags and compositions. If that could start happening with some of the rags associated with Sikh or Punjabi tradition, I mean, getting to know, or at least listening to some renditions of Maru, and I know they differ, or Tukardi, Champak. I mean, my impressions are these are beautiful rags. They have a wonderful charm and unique flavor to them. And if I were even a performing sitarist, I might be inclined to learn them and do them in my own way. This is a sort of a non-political perspective on it, but that these rags and compositions are beautiful, and it would be interesting to see them enter the Hindustani repertoire that way.
Thank you very much, Peter. I was told that we have about 9 minutes. I don't know whether Bhai wants to answer, or maybe we can keep another question and then answer in case. Gustavo, please go ahead. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here with you today. My question is mostly directed to Balbinder Singh Bhogal about decolonization. So the question is, how do we work towards decolonization without placing secularism in the center? And I ask this because I remember reading that book by Tomoko Masuzawa, and the impression I got is that she was doing the same to Christianity that Christianity did to the rest of the world religions, right? She's placing herself as a secular scholar who feels disgusted with those scholars who sympathize or promote or support religion in any form. And then she's attacking and making Christianity a monster. And then secularity is put in the center, secularism is put in the center. and all religions are monsters. So how do we avoid that? How do we decolonize, allowing each religion to have its place, right? Yeah, so that's my question.
Thank you, Gustavo. Balbinder, would you like to quickly reply, please? And unmute yourself, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was waiting for Baldeep to reply to Peter. Sure. Brilliant question, and one that I'm fully aware of, and it requires a background knowledge of what is secularity and how secularity emerges from a religious discourse, and that the secularity could be some kind of trick that is established as a continuation of a singular viewpoint that's neutral and objective, but is not implicated in power and class and struggles and etc. So you're right to question the shift to a new secular that seems to be suggestive of a way to speak correctly. But I think Baldeep Singh has already given us the beginnings of the answer in terms of, and also Professor Nirinjan Kaur, about the ecology of knowledges that have resisted colonization, that have resources within them to start to offer a different vantage about what education is and can be. And Dr. Nirinjan Kaur says a brilliant quote by Paulo Freire about whether education would lead to eventually a conformist mode, which is what we would do. We would conform to a secular perspective rather than the practice of freedom. Who's interested in the practice of freedom? Power is not interested in that. So there's structures within the academy that are complicit with conforming forces. And you're right to be critical of all scholars that fall into that. One is to have one's sovereignty of voice become acknowledged. That's a difficult thing. I forgot to read the last page, but one quote, and I'll end with this, by Minolo says, "The politics of enacting and constructing loci of enunciation are at stake, rather than the diversity of representations resulting from different locations in telling or building theories." And that's what's happened. Our mode of enunciation has been already colonized. And the secular pretends to be the space of pluralism, whereas I was trying to argue that pluralism has already been co-opted by another displacing discourse, that is, what you've pointed out, is the secular. Baldeep Singh, Nirinjan Kaur, and those that are in indigenous knowledge systems have a vantage point to speak from an experience, not a logic, from an experience that can challenge the logics that imprison us. I'll end there because I know the time is short.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
And to respond to
Yes,
Peter,
please.
just a very quick one, in the sense that there are, as I have learned now, since 1980, my education, that is now good 42 years long and 34 years of field work, what I understood, which meant, why am I referring to that, is like it requires a body of work. I'm not talking of how many years, but it takes as much time when systems are lost. It's a miracle that I have been able to do field work that long. If it was anything short, I would not have reached the right conclusions. So it is important to safeguard endangered intangible heritage systems. If they are lost, the recovery is a total different, orbit or, reality. How? Let's say we think of a parameter that it has to be Dhrupad, that it will be a rag form. Now in Dhanasari's, Multani and Dhanasari, there is a Dhrupad, which is centuries old. There is a Dhanasari of the Bhairavi Mela, there is a Dhrupad, which is centuries old. The Dhanasari of the Kafi Mela, there is the Dhrupad of century, which is centuries old. So it's a miracle that you find some memory bearer who has a comprehensive understanding of that raga. What was first? What was the adaptive use or reuse of that? So yes, there are at times there is Maru form, but people like in Rajasthan and other places, they may have one form, but a pedagogue like me or a grammarian like me would be wanting to search more. Are there other forms of Rag Maru within that system? So there is not one entity of a raga system. Every rag had multiple forms. That is one. Two, Pushti Marg and others, yes, people can do what they want, but people who are doing is like they're waking up to the idea. My conversation or debate with some of the elders, including Pandit Jasraj, for example, on rag malas, which Ellen Miner's note was, spoken by very well about. I'm glad that Francesca mentioned rag mala system now. There was a thing where Pandit Jasraj said in an evening where Amjad Ali Khan at Gwalior for the Hafiz Khan Award, with Faimuddin Khan of the Dagurwani was being honored. Having breakfast, he said, "Oh, we have the Ragmala." I said, "But all the Ragmala ragas evidence that you're giving a Chota Khayals. Do you have the Drupads of the Ragmala evidence?" And he said, "Oops, you know that," kind of a thing. So rag forms, how we use them, what we take and adapt is one thing. But when we look at the search for original rag forms, it is not that we rest at the very first rag form that we find. We need to continue the search on that raga to find more and more evidence before we can somehow reach a conclusion, or we must leave that we have found 4, 5, 6 forms without knowing which was the first one.
Thank you, Bhai Sab. We have just 1 minute, and I'm sorry that we cannot take other questions, but although the recording will stop, you can always write your questions in the chat, and I will share the questions with my colleagues. Before we end, I would like to thank all the attendees, of course, my co-panelists, and of course, I would love to thank, and I forgot earlier to mention the organizers of the ICTM dialogues, Soy Bentan, and Carlos Jodler, Eric Escudero. Thank you so much for making it possible. And thank you for joining us. I hope that this was a thought-provoking session and that we will continue together. You see, there's a lot to do. We spoke about the impact of colonization, but also, as Professor Bhogal mentioned, the violence of colonization. And I would say the violence of the colonization of memory. So that leads to new interpretations that have to be critically discussed. And I hope that we will continue together. So with that, I thank you very much. 12:59 in New York. And I wish you a wonderful day. Sat Sri Akal, and look forward to continue together this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Everyone at the ICTM, yes.
Thank you so much for organizing this.